Alright, I'm going to try to start reading as much of my fantasy as I can. See if I can get maybe a good hour of reading. See how this goes. So, this is going to be... See if I can get through the first 2 chapters of the super rough draft of the untitled Nyx Dinky story. Alright, so we got chapter 1, The Test. Breathe. Eyes closed, turning the mind outwards. What could she hear? What could she feel? The cold marble under her hooves, the sound of wind softly rustling down the corridor. Still the mind, settle it, quiet it. Feel the points of contact of her weight on the floor. Feel the subtle air currents moving around her horn, down along her long neck, past her back, even between her feathers. This was the practical test. The written exam was behind her. No recitations of facts or formulae lay beyond doors. Already her horn throughput had been measured. When those twin doors opened, she would be given a novel magical puzzle, one created just for her, to test her mental flexibility and ability to adapt, to change her magic on the fly. So the key was to pay maximum attention and think creatively. Be here now. As Twilight had taught her, she focused on the sound of her breathing, not internally, but against the very hairs that ringed her nostrils. When her mind wandered, as it inevitably did, she refused to pass judgment on herself, but instead centered it with gentle but firm intention on anything she could perceive outside of herself. Her mind roamed around the space in search of a sound on which her attention could land. A mental anchor, or at least a mental barnacle. Somewhere down the hall, a mechanical clock, grandfatherly with a pendulum, ticked and faintly echoed. Presently it struck the hour. A single gong. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Then a more interesting sound in front of her. She heard the scraping of a chair and the sound of muted approaching hoofsteps. Then the unlocking of a spring mechanism, the turning of the doorknob, and the screeching of metal hinges that needed oiling, a high pitch that contrasted with the low thrum of the heavy wooden doors as they opened. "Nyx Sparkle of the House Twilight?" the voice inquired. Nyx smiled, for she oddly felt pride at having filled out her name and the application forms in the most formal and serious way she could think of. Grandiose, even. Usually there were few things Nyx disliked more than grandiosity, but she had embraced it with gusto here, as if to signal the seriousness of her ambition. Nyx opened her eyes and was grateful for the warm, welcoming smile that blossomed upon the face of the unicorn mare before her, who held a clipboard in front of her with her magic. Nyx returned the smile. The mare half turned her body and raised a hoof, showing off the dark interior hallway as a model might show off a new carriage in a carriage showroom. Nyx obeyed the beckoning and heard the door shut behind her, her dragon-slid eyes quickly adapting to the dim light as they walked down the corridor to another smaller set of doors. The mare opened one with her magic and nodded inward, indicating that Nyx would walk through these doors alone. "There's no darkness here." 6 long, narrow-paned windows lined the full height of each of the walls to her left and right, which rose 5 times as high as she was long. They would not be out of place in Canterlot Castle, except the panes were clear leaded glass instead of colored. This was Celestia's school, after all, and apart from the ancient Baroque extravagance of the Great Hall, the buildings were utilitarian, marble floors excepted, and even those had a practical function, for marble was a magical damper and aided in containing runaway magical chain reactions that a young student might accidentally set off. Not that the simplicity made these hallowed halls any less hallowed, or, at this very moment, any less intimidating. She was in the auditorium of the school, but the low, well-padded wooden benches that filled it when speakers or school events used the space had been removed and stored off somewhere out of sight. The entire building was in fact oddly empty. Usually, applicants waited outside awaiting their turn, often surrounded by encouraging friends and family, but her examination was the only one scheduled for today, a Saturday, during a long holiday weekend explicitly chosen so that the school would be close to empty. Nyx had been told this was to minimize the chances that any of the other applicants might make a scene at her presence, but deep inside her anxiety told her it was a security measure in case her test went awry. Why else would she have been instructed to come alone? Nyx heard the floorboards beneath her creaking in time with her hoofsteps and realized that the wooden floor was bare. Nothing covered it. A good sign, she thought. This meant the test would not involve fire or corrosive chemicals or potions. She raised her sight and saw a long wooden table spread on the far end of the room. On it lay 3 large boxes, each about half as long as her own body, covered in what looked like shawls of black velvet that were so thick and black they ruthlessly swallowed every photon that dared to settle upon them. The materials she would work with were certainly inside. As she continued to look ever more upward, she spotted the examiners who sat behind 3 shorter tables on the raised stage past the test table. The tables were also simple, but she could not help thinking of the benches of a court, with judges ready to cross-examine her every flaw. In front of the testers sat nothing more than long notepads and quills. No measuring devices were present. There were 5 examiners, 3 mares, 2 stallions. She recognized them as the stallions immediately, but could not place the other one nor any of the mares. Editorial note. Might be worth describing these characters. Perhaps the mare that is described most clearly would be one of our arithmetic profs, the other arithmetic prof being an RCU math prof that she tagged teaching the class. None of them wore spell nexus. She had hoped the headmaster of the school would not be one of her testers, but now that it was confirmed he would not be, she vaguely wished he was, for reasons she could not articulate. Apart from one dramatic conversation in Nyx's home office as he wallowed in the depths of depression on that heart-warming eve following her abdication from the throne Nyx had never wanted, they had never really had any one-on-one conversations other than a handful of very brief letters on thaumaturgical topics. The awkwardness between them remained sky-high. The stallion she did recognize, an academic associate of her mother and an old friend of her grandfather, a stallion with whom she had exchanged polite words in person on a few occasions, was in the middle seat, indicating he would run the proceedings. He was a blue-coated stallion with a white mane and yellow eyes. He wore a brown sweater vest over a light grey dress shirt and a dark grey tie. This was, in fact, the same outfit he had worn every time she had seen him, and Nyx vaguely wondered how many copies of this outfit he owned and what that said about him. His name was Bastian Yorsitz. He was the researcher to whom Celestia had entrusted the decoding of the cult spell, the very spell that had created Nyx. The paper on said matrix spell that he had co-authored with Spell Nexus about a year after Nexus had been reinstated to school had created quite the stir in the academic community, or so Twilight had informed her daughter. More importantly for Nyx, she knew the stallion had also led the proceedings during her mother's practical exam when she was an absurdly young special applicant to the same school, so young she lacked her cutie mark. The cutie mark she would in fact gain during the test itself. Even if the parallel universe hypothesis were true, Nyx could not conceive of any universe where his presence in the same position, to carry out the same job, could possibly be a coincidence. Nyx came to a stop in front of the long table containing the 3 boxes. The examiners stared at her silently. Their faces were impassive, professional, so impervious to scrutiny they looked ready to compete in the final of the All Equestria Poker Championship. There was not even a glint of recognition in the eyes of Bastian Yorsitz, but though their faces remained impassive, there were hungry glints in the eyes of the 4 others, whose sight could now feast upon the teenage nightmare moon that might walk their halls and sit in their classes come fall. Bastian broke the stalemate with a wan, merely polite smile. His lips parted and he intoned, "Nyx Sparkle, are you ready to begin?" "Yes," Nyx replied, and she was happy to note that she sounded more confident than she felt. "Good. Please place yourself squarely in front of the middle box that rests on the table before you." Nyx complied, making sure she was standing directly in front of the absolute middle of the absolute middle box. "Now kindly remove the covering with your magic. Peer inside. Once you have mentally identified all the items inside, look up to signal you are ready for further instruction." Nyx pulled off the heavy velvet shawl, which fell to the floor with a thump. She peered inside. Nyx shut the door to her grandparents' home as softly as she could given her exhausted state, but she still winced as the panes of glass that flanked the door gave off a slight tinkle. Soft, thudding footfalls approached, the kitchen door swung open, and out poked the head of Twilight Velvet, smiling warmly, yet somewhat tensely, before asking, "How was it?" "Tiring. A nastily exhausting wizarding test, if you will. Come in the kitchen. I'll get the tea kettle going." Nyx settled down on a stool at the kitchen table. Her grandmother hummed to herself as she laid a cup of tea in front of her. She was so tired that the flow of time seemed to alter, and she felt like the tea was on her lips within seconds of her arrival at the kitchen. It was warm and creamy, chamomile, It would not take long for the soporific effects of the tea to overtake her tired body, and she would quickly set off for Luna's realm, even though Celestia's sun still shone outside. But for now, her grandmother sat there expectantly. She goaded her again. How long did they have you in there for? 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours? The time allotted is 2. Yeah, Grandma, seriously. I failed the last of the tests. I just couldn't do it. Wow, 3.5 hours! Nyx was too tired and too anxious to notice her grandmother positively beamed. Like I said, I failed the last. Did they take notes? Velvet interrupted. Oh yeah. They filled those notepads up with all my mistakes, I'm sure. They did not stop writing. Congratulations! And like that, Velvet was wrapped around her granddaughter. They disentangled and returned to the respective sides of the table. Nyx boring into her grandmother with a confused and intensely quizzical look. Velvet took a sip of her tea, set the cup down on the saucer, and explained, Nyx, it sounds like you obliterated the test. Nyxie, listen, they're not gonna write down notes on how to help you improve unless they're taking you on board. Also, you were there for 3.5 hours. You must have been showing them something special indeed. The test is an adaptive test. They put forward one task, and then based on your performance on that task, they set a harder one, and a harder one, and a harder one. Everyone fails the last task because the test only ends when the applicant fails a task. The longer it takes, usually the better. I've never heard of anyone going past the 2-hour mark, let alone 3.5 hours. Most successful applicants barely make it past the first hour. Nyx was a little skeptical. She had never known Twilight Velvet to lie, but she could be simply viewing the situation through rose-colored glasses. Mom did not tell me any of this, and I know she only had one task to do when she took the test. Oh well, family members of applicants who themselves taken the test are not allowed to describe the test beyond what it says in the admissions brochure. The test is more than just an admissions test. The examiners also use it to explore the applicant's potential and see what interesting abilities could be further developed if they may have them. If applicants knew that after an hour or so they had essentially passed, they might stop giving their full effort past that point, and that would stop the school from using the test to its full capacity. As to your mother's case, well, see, Twilight had a rather dangerous search of magic during the first task. They stopped the test immediately. Your grandfather and I were there in the room, you'll recall. It's less that your mother passed the test, and more that it was instantly determined that it would be incredibly dangerous if someone with your mother's potential went to any other school. Velvet took another sip of her tea. I'm not supposed to share my speculations on this, but, well, it's over, so clearly nothing bad happened. I think they were kind of a little scared that the same thing might happen with you. It's tradition for the applicant's family to wait for them outside the auditorium, but we were told to send you alone. And Bastian told your grandfather he'd been selected to run the exam. He wasn't supposed to tell Night like that, mind, but he did. Bastian ran your mother's exam, you know. Oh, Nyx thought to herself with a pit forming in her stomach. Her little anxious voice had been righted again. The school was indeed abandoned, and Bastian Yorsitz was indeed the chief examiner, because they were afraid she might end up blowing up the school or something. She now remembered that the friendly receptionist who had shown her in was not around when the test ended. Had she hoofed it out of there, galloping to safety at top speed, once Nyx had entered the auditorium? She did not like that at all. She was, after all, Nightmare Moon. She had been created as a weapon by crazed cultists. She did not like being perceived as a threat or dangerous, and yet, well, she was. She was in fact dangerous. It drove her crazy. Still, it appeared she had passed the test after all, and with that the last bit of adrenaline left her system, and she felt near to collapse. Thanks, Grandma, for the tea, and the reassurance. She levitated the cup and saucer over to the sink and ran water over them. I'm going to take a nap. Velvet trotted over and nuzzled Nyx, rubbing her right cheekbone onto Nyx's left cheekbone. Nyx closed her eyes to focus on the feeling, and Velvet took the opportunity to plant kisses on Nyx's closed eyelids, causing Nyx to giggle. Go rest, dear. You earned it. Nyx opened her eyes and smiled at her grandmother. She sat there basking in the warmth of everything. The warmth of the tea in her belly. The warmth of the kitchen. The warmth of accomplishment. And above all, the warmth of her family's love. Incredible, wasn't it? Here she was, a weapon, a reincarnation of a villain that would have doomed all of the planet to extinction if she wasn't defeated. She had led a coup against this very society, against this very city, taking over by force that palace that sat above the city, the palace she had visited 100 times since, the palace where her friend and in many ways mentor, Luna, lived and worked. She had been destined, doomed, to be at war with this place, this city, and instead, she had been given another chance. Her aunt, Cadence, Velvet's daughter-in-law, had gone in hiding into the mountains of the north, with a band of Equestrian patriots to wage a fight to the death against Nyx if it came to that, so as to save the planet entire. And now that same Cadence had on several occasions entrusted her daughter, the rambunctious Flurry Heart, for Nyx to babysit. Here, she was happy and whole. Complete. Nyx climbed the stairs and headed to the second floor, and then she entered the Sanctum Sanctorum, the holiest of holies itself, Twilight's childhood bedroom. She always stayed here when she came with her mother on their frequent trips to the city to visit family or attend to business. But this was the first time she had come here completely alone, Twilight staying behind in Ponyville since they had both agreed their anxieties would only feed on each other before the practical test. Nyx looked around the room. Many interesting artifacts from Twilight's childhood beckoned to her, but none sang a more seductive song than a bronze telescope that sat on its tripod in front of the window. Nyx briefly glanced at it as she drew the curtains across the window. She looked over the bed. Planted in front of the main pillow was an old inhabitant of the room. Smarty Pants sat hunched over, well-worn, her graceful old age imparted her by so much love. Nyx levitated her to the desk that sat nearby and threw herself on the bed. She was so tired, she fell on the pillows in the bed without so much as removing the covers. And off she slipped into the warm embrace of sleep. Was it the color of Bastion Yorset's tie that did it? Because grey had been a theme in the dream world, and the tie had eventually resolved itself into the dark grey mane of a certain Pegasus classmate of Nyx's back in Ponyville. Rumble had been an old trusted friend, but over the last year or so, he had started showing up with increasing frequency in her dreams in ways that went way past the merely friendly and straight into the downright delectable. His flouncey mane bounced along in perfect rhythm to that sense of humor that always brightened her day. His eyes twinkled and made her feel warm and distracted, and his ears seemed to always swivel in just the right way when she spoke, always seeming as if he was paying perfect attention to her, as if nothing in the world was more fascinating than her voice. Those ears, my, the fur on them seemed so soft. She could just lean over and run the edge of her tongue along the edges, tracing the outline of his succulent little ear. Hearing Rumble's surprised laughter, she closed her lips on the ear. Oh, it felt so good between her lips. Maybe. Oh, it was silly. But if she could nibble on her what was in her mouth? Nyx came to and opened her eyes. She was wide awake as her irises expanded, and her stellar night vision let her see in the darkened room. It was a perk of having the most unique eyes in Equestria. She looked down and noted that her other unique features had done their work all too well. While asleep, she had embraced the longest pillow on the bed, wrapping herself around it. In one of the corners that tapered off, well, it apparently had stood in for the ear of her most, visually pleasing friend, for her fangs had ripped quite a severe tear, letting the down out of the pillow, set down covering quite a bit of the bed, and most of her tongue. Okay, got it. No nibbling on Rumble's ears. She then gave a small laugh, and a wistful sigh. It was only a dream. As far as she knew, Rumble didn't think of her that way. Sure, she had spotted Rumble, and truth be told, a few other stallions in her class, looking at her in the same way she had spotted older stallions looking at Fleur-de-Lis, or at Rarity when she was at her most gussied up. Rarity herself kept gushing over her mane and her proportions and body type, but Nyx guessed that this was both because Rarity was being nice since she basically was her unofficial aunt, and because Nyx had been priced in the service as a prototype model on 2 occasions when Luna had ordered dresses from Rarity. On confident days, Nyx could admit to herself that she was pretty, and on more confident days than that, she could even allow herself to believe that Rumble found her attractive. But it was one thing for a stallion to find a mare attractive, and another thing altogether for a stallion to allow himself to form feelings towards Nightmare Moon. None of it, in the end, might end up being real. But the physical damage she beheld was real. Not the first time she had ripped a pillow with her fangs in her sleep. She had a spell at the ready and used it to pick up as much of the fluff as she could find, stick it back in the pillow, and repair the damage with a quick suit spell. It wasn't anything Rarity would approve of, but it fixed the hole. Nyx looked around the dark room and opened first the thick curtains, and then the wooden-framed windows letting in the moonlight of the cold late winter air. The bronze telescope glinted in the shafts of reflected selenic glory. Nyx trotted over and ran her hooves on the cool metal. It was one of the top models available for home purchase, resembling an apple cider barrel with an opening on one end for the light to pour through, resting upon a sturdy tripod. Nyx knew her family was financially comfortable, but they were far from truly wealthy, and this telescope was a rather fantastic investment in bits for something to be used by a little filly in her bedroom. Then again, Nightlight was an astronomer, and he must have been delighted when his daughter expressed interest in his field. The investment had paid off, though. One of the first things Celestia had given Luna to reintegrate her to modern Equestria were a series of poems that Twilight Sparkle, as a young and quite literally star-struck filly, had written in praise of the beauty of the night. That Nightmare Night, just before Nyx's birth, when Luna had dramatically crashed Ponyville's Nightmare Night celebration, she had sought out Twilight, firstly, to thank her for freeing her from the nightmare, but secondly, to get to know her sister's protégé, the young scholar who so loved the night that she had written the infantile but heartfelt words that kept Luna company those first few weeks back. Nyx lowered her head to look through the eyepiece. It was pointed to nothing in particular, but she felt great joy in resting an eye on the same eyepiece that her mother's eyes had rested upon so many times. Just as she began thinking of a star or a constellation and wished to point the telescope, a burst of red light occurred, rendered blinding magnification of the telescope. She removed her eye from the eyepiece and scanned the skies. There! A flash of red light, followed a few seconds later by a dull, distant thud. Fireworks! Not professional looking, but someone somewhere shooting off a bottle rocket. Ponies were a boisterous, festive bunch. She briefly remembered when, during her abortive little coup, she had brought back the sun to fend off the creeping cold. The ponies of Spoonyville spontaneously threw a festival. While Pinkie Pie was absent in Camelot, it seemed that the long holiday weekend was enough of an incentive. As a third burst of color exploded across the sky, Nyx realized stargazing would have to wait for much later in the evening. She looked at the clock by the bedside, which marked a few minutes past 9. She had slept for perhaps 3 hours, and had renewed energy. The night was still young. She thought about trotting off to Canterlot Castle in the off chance that Luna would be free, since given the festive atmosphere, it seemed likely that no one would have been in the mood to show up for night court, at least of all on a Saturday night like this. But then she quickly remembered the reason why she was not going to be able to see Luna during this particular visit to Canterlot. There was some kind of international conference, marking the 75th or 100th anniversary of something or other. It wouldn't do for a teenage filly to go bursting into some boring dinner full of stuffy diplomats to claim the co-ruler of Equestria as her playmate. As she pondered her options, Nyx caught snatches of different songs coming from different directions, carried far by the crispness of the cool late winter air. She pleasantly shivered in the cold, and then closed the windows, her mind made up. The town was full of tourists. What would be one more? Nyx turned on the light in the adjoining bathroom and quickly jumped in the shower. After a brief moment, she toweled herself off and opened the closet and dragged out her suitcase. She opened it out and floated out what she was looking for. It was a Rarity special, made by the best crafts pony in her shop under the fashionista's exact specifications and tailored specifically for Nyx. It was essentially a jumpsuit made out of silk and filled with down feathers. Not particularly warm, but one of the best features of the Pegasus parts of her alicorn physiognomy was her resistance to climactic extremes. It was form-fitting and fashionable, but because it was the exact same shade of black as her coat, it hardly called out attention to itself, which was the point. She jumped into the lower part and used the magic to guide herself into the top and zipped it up. She moved her wings into the most comfortable position, comfortable position, because what made this jumpsuit a rarity special was that Nyx would be the only one who could properly wear it. Running on the sides of the upper part of the jumpsuit were two slits that were essentially invisible when the suit was zipped up, but when worn properly, the slits lined up with her wings in precisely the correct angle, so Nyx could quickly slide on her wings out to assist just like a switchblade. In that position, the void on the inside jacket that otherwise housed her wings presented space for her muscles and joints so that she could fly with the suit on, and then when done, she could retract her wings back to the inside, the void hiding the outline of her wings, so she could become a mere unicorn once again. The feature had been Twilight's idea. She had called it a security feature, and Twi had contributed to the design. Apparently, the outfit was some kind of breakthrough. Not many jumpsuits had a step in their design process in which Twilight sparkled from a whiteboard with trigonometry, and a second copy had eventually been made for Rainbow Dash using Dash's inventions, and apparently the Wonderbolts had since expressed interest in a prototype. But Nyx was more grateful for its comfort at this moment. It wasn't much of a disguise, Nyx hated those anyways, as anyone who got a good look at her face would recognize her instantly. But anyone who she spoke to face was likely to be a Canterlottian who would already be familiar with her, and the jumpsuit would help her blend in and make her less noticeable to out-of-towners. She took out a loose cream-colored scarf from her luggage. She looked at its design with affection, looking at the brown heart motif that repeated on it. The scarf had been a gift from Luna's, until one day she gave it to Nyx, noting the frequency with which Nyx had expressed how much she liked it. She wrapped it around the lower part of her neck, letting it rest just above where the collar of her jumpsuit ended, and after a quick brushing of her mane, and a last look in the mirror, trotted out of Twilight's room and down the stairs. There was activity in the kitchen, and Nyx trotted in calling out for her grandmother, but there was no one at the stove, just some potatoes boiling away. Her grandfather's voice came up from behind her. She stepped out for a moment to get something from the corner store. I started boiling the potatoes for her. She wants us to have a nice family lunch tomorrow before you leave for Ponyville, to celebrate. Nyx turned. Her grandfather, Nightlight, sat at the kitchen table with a newspaper laying in front of him. His eyes twinkled as he looked her up and down. Looking good. Going somewhere. Hey, Gramps. Yeah, just heading out for a walk, taking the nightlife. If I'm gonna live in this town, might as well get to know what this town has to offer. Not much nightlife in Ponyville, I suppose. Nyx smiled and moved over to her grandfather. The older stallion wrapped his front legs over her shoulder and then moved a little back, cupping her face tenderly in his hooves. He looked into her eyes. Be safe. Please be safe. Gramps, it's the safest city in Equestria. No Hydra's gonna attack me in the city crawling with royal guards. It's not Hydras I worry about, Nyxie. You're a pretty filly, walking around, alone, at night. There's gonna be a lot of drunk idiots out there. Nyx disentangled herself from her grandfather. She raised a hoof absently and nervously fiddled with the end of her scarf, her ears unconsciously flattening against her head as she looked at Nightline. Do you think I should stay in? You only live once, Nyx. You're basically an adult. In a few months you'll be here and you'll want to socialize. No, you'll have to socialize. You should definitely go out. Just keep to clean, well-lighted places with lots of other ponies. I know how to defend myself, Gramps. Nightlight chuckled while staring at his granddaughter, who had one single hoof at least stumped her way through a good proportion of the monsters of the Airfree. Of that, I have not the slightest doubt. Now go! And with that, he nodded towards the corridor, encouraging her to leave. Nyx trotted out of the house and covered the 10 or so pony lengths to the sidewalk easily. She stopped and looked back at her grandparents' home, the house her mother grew up in. It was a solid, dignified affair, square, with large windows which glowed in the evening. Hardly a mansion like the one Spell Nexus lived in, let alone the estates that bordered the castle which the noble families referred to as pied-à-terres, which they were in function, even if they violated the spirit of the term. No, Twilight's childhood home was small enough to be warm and cozy. It had the same solidity that was reflected in the houses that surrounded it, and indeed in the very neighborhood. Nyx could not help but contrast this street with those of Ponyville. In Ponyville, there was next to no zoning, and it was common to see wildly different architectural styles rumble next to each other. Here, there was a regimented order, and the homes all looked roughly similar: square, solid, enduring. The exterior frames were made of stone chiseled out of Mount Canterlot itself, whereas in Ponyville, wood was the dominant material. The key here was the location. A kilocanter to the west was the start of the steep slope that was home to Canterlot Castle and the House of Nobles, as well as the main building of the central government itself. To the south of that, and down the slope, was Market Square, with its embassies, restaurants, boutiques, and nightlife. At the opposite direction, about a kilocanter and a half away, was Royal Canterlot University, and adjoining it on the far side was Celestia School. In the middle were dense middle-class apartments and a handful of upper-class streets that housed non-noble captains of industry like Fancy Pants, and not so rich but still well-connected elites like Spellnexus himself. And then, perfectly placed within trotting distance of all of the above, the solid, unpretentious, but still immensely desirable upper-middle-class neighborhood housed higher functionaries of the government and a motley assortment of scientists, professors, advisors, lawyers, analysts, and other technocrats that served the throne, interspersed with a smattering of the not-so-absurdly wealthy member of Canterlot's entrepreneurial class. This neighborhood. Her neighborhood. Once again, Nyx had to smile. Nightmare Moon of Stepford Lane. Here she was, the Vogiemare herself, terror of Equestria, sworn enemy of the throne, whose villainous visage ruled over her eponymous fall harvest festival and traded foes' lives for candy. Nightmare Moon, who had taken over the city by force just 5 years ago by infiltrating its defenses through deceit and disguise, was standing outside her grandparents' home, in just about the most respectable street, in the most respectable neighborhood, in the whole country. If the door of the house facing her had swung open, and the elderly judge living there had stepped out, looking at the dragon-slitted eyes and fanged jaws of the most feared pony in Equestria illuminated by the light spilling out of his door, would he have screamed? Called the royal guards? Of course not. The honorable Judge Proximate Cause would have waved a friendly wave, and turned over for a polite chit-chat, asking Nyx if she had enjoyed that pie he had made for her from the sweet apple acre apples she had given him in her previous visit to his home. Life did take some strange turns, didn't it? Another red flash of light and distant boom brought her out of her revelry. Nyx stood there, ghostly curlicues of steam rising from her face as her hot breath hit the cold air. Her ears scanned, twitching, until she caught a snatch of song in the air, and she was off, chasing the music, searching for revelry in the night. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. I am no legend. She wandered off looking for light and laughter, but oddly found herself retracing her steps from earlier that morning, and was soon looking at the stately red brick buildings of the Royal Canterlot University. The campus looked serene in the moonlight, but serenity is not what she was looking for. As she stepped onto one of the campus pathways, she saw a group of ponies heading towards her.
Alright, continuing, this will be Nyx Dinky, Untitled Story, Chapter 2. Let's see where it is. What's it called? I believe it's called I'm No Legend. Yes, I am no legend. Okay. Chapter 2. I am no legend. She wandered off looking for light and laughter, but oddly found herself retreating her steps from earlier that morning, and was soon looking at the stately, red, brick buildings of Royal Canterlot University. The campus looked serene in the moonlight, but serenity is not what she was looking for. As she stepped onto one of the campus pathways, she saw a group of ponies heading towards her. They resolved into the forms of 3 mares and 3 stallions. Given that each mare was walking shoulder to shoulder with one of the stallions, and that they were all clothed in rather sharp attire for university students, she guessed this was a triple date between 3 couples that were acquainted with each other. They passed her without a second look, interested only in each other, carrying on low conversations interspersed with flirty giggles. After about a minute, staying behind in the shadows, Nyx followed. A half-hour later, Nyx saw her quarry stop and turn and enter a doorway. As she arrived at the door, she saw a stallion standing outside giving her an interested but non-committal look. Bouncy jazz music sucked out of a half-open door, and inside she could spot what she assumed was a bar. She briefly considered trotting up to the door pony and asking to be admitted. On the one hand, she was rather seriously underage. On the other hand, she had spent a millennia on the moon, and that certainly entitled her to a stiff drink. Up ahead, she noticed that the amount of light was greatly increasing as more of the storefronts and buildings were lit up, indicating they were still open. After a bend in the road, she could see a square open up in front of her, and many ponies milling about. Nyx stepped out and looked around. She had arrived at Market Square, the commercial heart of Canterlot. During the day, the square was lined with chicks' shops and cafes, visited by the ponies that worked in nearby offices. On weekend nights like tonight, the stores stayed open late, and chairs and tables spread out from the cafes to cover a large part of the cobblestone square. Diners, both locals and out-of-towners, sampled some of Equestria's best cuisine as traveling musicians traveled from table to table. The center of the square was an open space which sometimes was filled with dancing couples on nights when the Canterlot Symphony Orchestra would put on free waltz concerts. Though tonight, the atmosphere was more conducive to packs of fillies in coats chasing each other around the open square. Lording over it all, on the far end of the square from where Nyx stood, was the Grande Dame of equestrian hospitality, the Grand Canterlot Hotel, a 5-story tall structure of granite and alabaster, whose swooning curves brought to mind a gracefully half-melted wedding cake. It was the destination of choice of foreign diplomats, and any very important pony from out of town made a point of being seen in its tea room during their time in Canterlot. In essence, it served as the unofficial waiting room for Canterlot Castle, and it was no surprise that a certain fashionista unicorn proudly displayed her personal collection of the tea room's souvenir menus in her apartment overlooking the Carousel Boutique. The largest concentration of ponies in the square seemed to stand directly in front of it, and presently Nyx became aware of oohs and ahs emanating from the crowd. This struck Nyx as odd and worthy of investigation. Ponies were a socially graceful bunch, and even those tourists who counted celebrity spotting as one of their highlights of their planned trip to Canterlot would refrain from such outre behavior. As for Canterlotians, accustomed to seeing Celestia and Luna sauntering about with at most a guard or two, they would consider it the height of impropriety to make a spectacle of themselves by ever behaving in such a manner. Something very unique must be happening to cause such commotion. Nyx made her way into the crowd and spotted one of the matte black carriages used by high-ranking government officials for local transportation parked directly in front of it. A royal guard walked towards the door of the carriage and opened it, but it was not a pony that walked out. Instead, the figure that walked out was unlike any that Nyx had previously witnessed. He stood on his hind legs and was taller than any pony she had ever seen. His head resembled that of a bull, with 2 powerful horns on his head. His eyes, however, glinted with intelligence. He was clearly male and very muscular. Instead of hooves, his front legs ended in paws, but the digits were extended into long, tentacle-like protuberances that had 2 joints each which allowed them to bend dexterously, like those of the monkeys that lived in the trees of the Zebrican jungles. Blue fur covered his chest and back, and he was ornamented with what looked like a golden belt that strapped around his right shoulder and descended down to his waist, where it buckled onto the waistline of the trousers he wore, which covered the lower half of his body and his upper legs. The belt was decorated with what looked like massive nuggets of raw gold bullion, which were rough-hewn but still screamed important. The figure turned around to the carriage, and then 2 other figures emerged from the carriage, and they were in essence identical to the first and hard to tell apart from each other. A word popped into Nyx's brain: Minotaurs! As the bipeds, flanked by equestrian royal guards, vanished into the interior of the Grand Canterlot Hotel. And with that, she remembered what the event that had happened this evening at the castle was all about. Last year was the 100th anniversary of the end of a war between Zebrica and the Minotaur Empire. The year after the end of the war, it had seemed the peace treaty would unravel and the war could start up again. So Celestia stepped in as a third party and ensured the peace by sending in a force of royal guards to patrol the border between the two for a few years until the situation calmed down. Zebras! Nyx remembered Zecora, the shaman who lived in the Everfree and was Applebloom's particular friend. Zecora had been the one who had alerted the authorities when Twilight Sparkle had been pony-napped by the very cult that created Nyx. Zecora had narrated the school play that revealed to Nyx that she had to be in some way Nightmare Moon. It was Zecora who had hid Twilight from the cultists after she had almost been executed, and it was Zecora who had barged into Nightstone Castle and demanded that Nyx defend Ponyville from the monsters of the Everfree. Zecora had played a crucial role in Nyx's first year of life, and yet Nyx knew next to nothing about her. She was an odd creature, who spoke in rhymes and riddles and refused to reveal much about her past. Her mother had told her that she was some kind of exile. Apparently, Zecora's grandfather had been a high-ranking shaman who had come to a severe disagreement with the ruling circle in Zebrica, and he and his family had been banished and dispersed, eventually settling in Equestria and keeping away from each other for safety's sake. But that was all Twilight herself knew. Even Applebloom, who spent more time with Zecora than anyone else in Ponyville, wasn't much help in clearing the mystery that surrounded the zebra's life before her arrival in the town. As the crowd dispersed around her, Nyx looked around to see if she could spot one of the striped equines. The conference had clearly ended, and so the zebra delegation might be heading back to the hotel as well. She would have loved to briefly talk to one of them, if only to see if they all spoke with Zecora's rhythmic speech patterns. Of all the sapient races of Equestria, zebras were the most similar to ponies, and yet Nyx knew more about griffin culture than she knew about the zebras. But alas, her curiosity would remain unsated. No zebras were visible anywhere. Perhaps the zebras had gotten to the hotel first. Or perhaps they were staying somewhere else. There was a distant flash of lightning. Nyx turned up towards the sky, but the moon brightly shone and there was not a cloud in sight. Indeed, no rain or storms had been ordered for tonight. Not lightning, then there! A small flash of light from the very top of Mount Canterlot. Nyx stared for a minute, until she spotted another. Oh, the lookout on top of Mount Canterlot! Nyx had visited during the daytime. She had not realized it was open at night. Pretty long walk up the steep mountain. But why walk? As if they were spring-loaded, Nyx's wings shot out through the slits in her jumpsuit. She flexed them a couple of times, and then she hopped up and flapped down and hovered briefly in the air. She heard a couple of surprised gasps from some of the other ponies in the plaza. With a strong wing beat, she was off, heading towards the top of Mount Canterlot at top speed. The wind, it was cold and bracing and delicious as it streamed under and around and between her wings. It enveloped her in a cool, crystalline cocoon. She could modulate it, of course, with her body's own speed. If she wanted it brisk and invigorating, she would flap her wings with strong, hard downbeats and tuck her legs in to decrease the drag. If she wanted slower and gentler, she would spread her wings and glide. The wind gave her freedom and power. Today, she was all about speed. She shot off into the night, heading to the top of Mount Canterlot, the spires of Canterlot Castle soaring off to her right. Faster than she was expected, she was above the overlook. And looking down it, she could see clusters of ponies on the left side of the overlook, peering down directly into the courtyards of Canterlot Castle below, and on the front of the overlook, looking over central Canterlot. She scanned for a landing pad far from the crowd, and saw the right side of the overlook was deserted. She landed in the darkness and retracted her wings. Not sooner had she wondered if anyone had spotted her when she felt a brush of wind, and the sound of wings snapping shut behind her, followed immediately by the sound of iron-shod hooves landing on the concrete courtyard. The politely stern, practiced speech of a royal guard issued forth. Ma'am, due to the conferences, the skies above Canterlot are restricted airspaces closed to civilians tonight. When you leave the overlook, please make sure to do it by hoof. Forgive me. I did not mean to make a scene. Oh, no scene was made, ma'am. Yes. Oh! for Nyx had at this moment turned to face the guard, and he realized whom he was addressing. "I did not know you were in town, Highness," and he cut himself off, his official mask slipping away as he became visibly flustered. "I don't know how to address you, though I have been told that you have requested that we never call you Highness or Princess, and ma'am seems too impersonal." "Nyx is my name, so you can just call me Nyx. What's your name?" "Sergeant Sweeper, Miss Nyx." "Just Nyx, please. I assume your first name is not Sergeant." "My name is Shadow Sweeper." "Well, it's a pleasure meeting you, Shadow. Tell me, do you always work the night shift?" "No, but now that you mention it and I come to think about it, I do work at night more often than not." "So it's not so much that you sweep the shadows away, but more that you sweep the shadows for signs of danger?" He chuckled at this. "Well, I try to," and he smiled at her. He was a rather handsome thing, dark gray and well built with hazel. He was a rather handsome thing, dark gray and well-built with hazel eyes and what seemed like a scar accenting his chin. In fact, he looked quite a bit like Rumble. Rumble was a lighter thing, better suited for speed and less for hoof-to-hoof combat. And when he fully grew his body out, he probably would never be as stocky as Shadow, unless Rumble picked up an addiction to the heavier weights at the gym. But still, the resemblance was striking, and Nyx idly wondered whether to ask the good sergeant if he happened to have any relatives in Ponyville. Still, the endorphins were flowing. Perhaps she could tease the good sergeant with the kind of conversation she wished she had the self-confidence to engage her cute Pegasus friend with. A sergeant assigned to Canterlot Castle himself would be too professional to do anything untoward. She could use him as a stand-in for Rumble, and the conversation would be a kind of rehearsal. She cocked her head and smiled at him. "A busy night tonight, Shadow?" "Yes, it has been busy. We've been manning the perimeter for the conference, and with it being a long weekend, we've been dealing with a lot of disappointed tourists. They want to go to the castle grounds and tour the gardens and look at the statues, but part of the conference tonight was held outside, so the grounds are closed." "Ah, but Canterlot has many other charms. I bet lots of out-of-towners gawk at all you guards taking pictures." "Some take pictures, yes." "And I bet some of the out-of-town mayors just drape themselves over you, using the picture as an excuse to get all close and personal to one of the strong stallions that put their life on the line to defend all we hold dear." She tried to bat her eyelashes in the most passable imitation of rarity she could muster. Was he blushing? It was hard to tell in the darkness. "Oh, you don't have to lie to me," she cooed. Yes, he was definitely blushing. "I come from a family with a proud military tradition. My uncle, Shining Armor, ran the Canterlot Garrison, and then became Captain General of the Royal Guard. And look at him, he married the Princess of Love. I'm sure the uniform helped turn Cadence, the most beautiful mare in Equestria, so they say, into my aunt. The mares do love the uniform, don't they, Shadow?" He stared intently at her. He seemed uncomfortable, but also utterly unable to look away. He was rooted to the spot, standing so squarely he looked like he was holding his ground as he stared down a rampaging manicore. She could not later explain to herself why she did such a stupid thing, except it was the kind of thing she would have wanted to do if it was indeed Rumble who had been standing in front of her. She lifted her front left hoof, intending to pat Shadow lightly on his cheek, to break the tension, and hopefully to put him at ease, to reassure him that there was no harm done. But of course, the second her hoof touched his cheek, catastrophe immediately followed. She touched him and he slightly jerked back as if a wave of electricity had coursed through him. He opened his mouth and she heard a sharp intake of breath, but most catastrophic of all was the swoosh as his wings fully extended to full rigidity, showing off their not inconsiderable span. Nyx led something of a purposefully sheltered life, but she read a lot. Rarity was almost her aunt. Cadence was actually her aunt. And above all, she had wings herself. She knew precisely what that unconscious physical reaction meant. He came to after a second or two. Then Shadow leaped back and put a good 3 pony lengths between himself and Nyx. He quickly closed his wings and opened his mouth, and what came out was not the voice of a stoic sergeant, but the voice of a young colt, caught by his mother in the kitchen with his hoof deep in the cookie jar. "Oh, I'm so sorry, madam. I didn't mean no, Shadow. I shouldn't have touched across the line." The stammered apologies came out of the both of them in a torrent, crashing with each other in midair, rendering them unintelligible, making communication impossible, as Nyx and Shadow verbally trampled each other in their mutual embarrassment. Finally, Shadow, "Please don't tell anyone." Finally, Nyx, "My fault. Please, I'm so sorry." Then, "Of course I won't tell." Of course she wouldn't. What a scandal. A guard lusting after the underage ward of Twilight Sparkle. What a scandal. Nightmare Moon flirting with a guard. If it got back to Ponyville, if Diamond Tiara heard about it, then a feeling as if a 50-pound weight had settled at the very bottom of her stomach. If Rumble heard about it. A quiet moment. Then Shadow spoke. "Ma'am, I think if it pleases you, I will stand guard over there, perhaps ensure that no one comes over and bothers you." Nyx would normally say that the last thing she would want is a guard keeping ponies away from her. But she knew this was Shadow trying to disengage in a way that allowed him at least some dignity. So she replied, "Yes, of course, Sergeant." Nyx turned over and trotted towards the nearest side of the overlook, the most vacant edge. She reached the low wall. She turned around to look at Shadow. Shadow was now 20 pony lengths away, facing towards the castle side and the remaining tourists assembled there. It was clear from his posture that nothing in the world was more important than looking in the exact opposite direction of where Nyx was. Still, this allowed Nyx to freely study the way that Shadow's armor outlined his body. Yes, she thought to herself, Rumble would look great in that uniform. Actually, I would look great in that uniform, come to think of it. She scanned the overlook and noticed that there were several guards, perhaps a dozen, scattered about. She wondered if they were a squad under Sergeant Sleeper's command, and if so, she deeply hoped none of them had seen her embarrass him. Security was indeed tight this evening. It was a rough life, that of the Equestrian soldier. It was a unique calling in a society where war was next to unknown. Nyx knew that in the ancient past there had been great conflicts of some kind or another, but in the last 1,000 years, wars had been something that happened over yonder. This was a good thing, of course, but Nyx couldn't help wondering how the ponies of Equestria would react to a full-on war. It was just so alien. One might as well ask how the ponies of Equestria would react to gravity ceasing to function. But it meant that those who signed up were of a unique constitution, and she could not help admiring them. She admired her uncle for the same reason. Nyx had pledged to Luna that she would dedicate herself to protecting those weaker than she was, the innocent. And that is what all of these guards were doing right now, in real life, even though they may as well be made of paper compared to how strong she would become when one day she grew back into her full strength. Nyx did not know what path her life would take after Celestia's school, and while she hungered for a normal life, she also knew she had to uphold her vow. And it already seemed clear to her that at some point that vow would take her through the guards. She did not think it would happen immediately after Celestia's school, but she knew the next school she would attend after it, at some point, would be the Royal Military Academy. The uniform of an officer candidate cadet was certainly in her future. Nyx placed her front legs on the wall parapet and looked out. From this particular vantage point, one looked over a humble residential district of Canterlot, and then, just past the Canterlot River, farmland began. At this altitude, the horizon line was a good 80 kilocanters away, which meant that, yes, off in the farthest distance, her keen night vision allowed her to spot the outline of the Everfree forest. A low fog was rolling off of it, the Everfree being one of the few places in Equestria where the weather was not wholly under the control of the Pegasi weather teams. And there, that spot in the fog, did it not faintly glow? She was not 100% sure, but it might be just where Ponyville was. It might be Ponyville. The lights of Nightstone Castle, of the original Carousel Boutique, of Sweet Apple Acres, of home struggling to break through the fog. She would be back there tomorrow night, and yet Nyx knew she would miss it already. She would miss her mother, and Rarity, and Apple Bloom, and Scootaloo, and Sweetie Belle, and Twist, and Rumble. Stupid little colt. He had not the slightest idea how much she would miss him, how she would not be able to stop aching for him, how she would miss his stupid little laugh. Would he miss her? They were friendly, yes, and in younger years had played together whenever her mother would place her in the care of Fluttershy's nurse friend, Flitter, on some afternoon when Twilight had to tend to some functionary or visiting scientist. But he would not miss her so much when he found some local marriages. Oh, that hurt. Her stomach knotted up and tensed. Don't think like that. She sighed. It wouldn't be his fault anyways. Nothing about being Nightmare Moon, living legend, provided her with the slightest hint about how to go about letting Rumble know what she truly felt for him. She was so excited about coming here, but still, she wished she could bring her home with her to Canterlot. Of course, her grandparents were here, and it was less than 2 hours on a train to get here from Ponyville, and that was a commute her mother still made quite often. Rarity had opened the Carousel Boutique on one of the side streets off of Market Square 2 years back, and business was apparently booming, so she would see her on occasion, perhaps with Sweetie Belle in tow. But still. Dinky had applied to Celestia School as well. She had been here 3 weeks before to take her practical exam and seemed cautiously optimistic about it when she got back to Ponyville. Nyx was willing to bet Dinky had passed the 1 hour mark easily. Dinky reminded her a lot of her mother, and not just because she had played Twilight in that momentous school play. Dinky was a brilliant thing, a bookworm with a knack for memorization, a gift for arcane languages, and the ability to teleport things with her horn, an ability that Twilight said was so rare in a pony Dinky's age as to possibly be unprecedented. Much of her friendship with Nyx had been built on the friendly competition they had with each other for the highest marks in the class every time the report cards were issued. They tended to alternate the top spot, but Nyx was an alicorn, the reincarnation of an ancient immortal being who grew up in a literal library under the strict tutelage of her mother. An ascended alicorn who was spoken of as the single most brilliant mind of her generation and had been a particular student of Celestia herself. The largest structure in the immediate surroundings of Ponyville was a castle that had been built for Nyx, damn it! Dinky, on the other hand, achieved essentially identical results while living in the humble home of her mother. A mare the crueler types in Ponyville viewed as hopelessly addled and permanently out to lunch. Dinky came from much humbler origins, and yet had managed to achieve so much through talent and force of will. Yet she was so humble herself, an incredibly self-possessed and calm filly. That was the main difference, personality-wise, between Dinky and Twilight. Twilight was a walking mass of anxiety, so prone to panic attacks that Nyx carried a checklist of different symptoms in her mind to check off, so she could predict what type of anxiety attack was the one her mother was about to undergo. Dinky, on the other hand, irradiated calm. She was the most polite filly Nyx knew, and while mares like Rarity worked on their manners as a matter of discipline, good manners and grace flowed out of Dinky like effortless emanations of her core personality. Being next to Dinky was like being next to a gently bubbling brook with birds singing above it. She made any room better, even if she did nothing at all. She was the calm in the storm. Nyx admired this greatly in her. She desperately hoped Nyx would be admitted, and that she would enroll. She could certainly use her presence. Wait, how were roommates assigned a dorm? Could she request that? Lady? It was a high voice, a small voice. Nyx turned from her reverie, turned from the wall, and looked around looking for the source. There seemed to be no one there. Then she remembered how small the voice was, and she looked down. This was the correct choice. There were 2 young colts standing half a pony length away from where her front hooves had landed when she dropped them from the wall. They wore woolen caps to protect from the cold, so she could not be sure, but the flatness of the caps and their square, low, sturdy bodies made her feel pretty sure these were earth ponies. The one that had spoken had a ruddy orange coloration to his coat that made her think of Big Macintosh, though the accent sounded like he might be from Vancouver or thereabouts, a place where she did not believe the Apple family had a branch, even as extensive as that family was. The other, slightly larger, had a coat with a creamy white complexion that reminded Nyx of Dinky's friend Pipsqueak, but he was pretty solidly white, without the pinto brown discoloration. Nyx did not need to try the spider flanks to know there were no cutie marks there. These colts were very young, at least 2 years younger than she herself had been, in terms of physical development, when she came to that accursed thorn bush in the Everfree. Yes? My cousin, little Macintosh pointed at the white colt beside him, says he saw you fly up here and... Well, we've been looking at you. And... She liked them already. She knew of course what their question would be, and they were precisely the age from which she enjoyed receiving this question. When adults asked the question, the results were a mixed bag. Young foals did not ask the question, but the results there were usually negative. The Cake twins had cried in fear when they first met her, and she had unfortunately had that reaction enough times since that she usually stayed away from babies and toddlers. All they understood once they saw her eyes was an instinctual predator. The day Cadence and Shining Armor first brought us still unable to stand on her hooves flurry heart to her grandparents' place that heartwarming eve some years back had been one of the most anxious days of Nyx's life. She had been terrified her cousin would be afraid of her, but thankfully the baby flurry had instead been instantly taken with her older cousin. But once foals reached a certain age, usually around 4 or 5, when they understood what a story was, and who Nightmare Moon was, once they'd gone trick-or-treating on a Nightmare Night for the first time, then magic happened. And that magic kept happening up until they hit puberty or thereabouts, when they became more interested in each other than in legends and myths. The world is scary by its very nature, and foals learn by playing, so some of that play must be scary. Nothing is more enchanting to a foal than encountering something very dangerous in an environment that assures them of their safety. What could possibly be more enchanting than traveling a long distance to your country's capital city, wondering if perhaps you would catch a glimpse of one of the princesses, and instead running into Nightmare Moon herself in the dead of night? Yes, a Nightmare Moon who was just a teenager wearing a silly jumpsuit and a cream scarf with brown hearts embroidered on it while standing in the middle of a tourist spot surrounded by royal guards. But Nightmare Moon all the same. Nyx stared at the 2 colts and then made a great show of looking at the moon, stretching out her neck dramatically towards it just to make sure the colts saw her looking at the moon. Then she turned back at the colts and smirked. She spoke to them, changing her voice into a deep register, and adopting an affected, blatantly pretentious tone, doing as much as she could to sound like an evil and arrogant version of Rarity, which for some reason she thought would be the voice the colts would expect from the character of Nightmare Moon. "Come then, what do you want to know?" Are you... Some fidgeting and a pause. Then, her? Why tell when you can show? Nyx slowly and as gracefully as she could let her wings out through the slits of her jumpsuit. She unfurled them slowly to their full length, as if she were a swan, drying her wings out pre-flight. She then folded them on the outside of her jumpsuit. She stared at the colts with her slitted eyes and smiled. A friendly, warm, and very broad smile. The very broadest smile she could muster. One calculated to make sure that her fangs were visible. She then lightly opened her mouth, just enough so the sharp tips of her white fangs contrasted with the dark interior of her mouth. Oh, how she hoped her fangs glistened in the moonlight. She was putting on a show, after all, and she did not wish to disappoint. Cousin Colt muttered something like, "Oh, wow," and then little Knot Macintosh spoke again. "I thought you were like a legend." "Oh no, I am no legend." She put out a hoof and leaned towards the colts. She wiggled it a bit, signaling that she wanted them to touch her. Tentatively, each colt stuck out a hoof and ran around hers, feeling the hoof and the fur on her lower leg, up to where the silken jumpsuit began to cover it. "So how does it feel?" Nyx inquired. The colts looked at her confused. Then Cousin Colt ventured. Good? Warm and fuzzy, like your hooves. I am flesh and blood, just like you." She removed her hoof, and before they could react, she quickly booped each of them on their noses. She couldn't help it. She even made the boop noises upon contact and giggled alongside the colts. Once they settled down, little Knot Macintosh spoke up. "Were you on the moon? 1,000 years? Nyx sat down on her haunches on the cold floor in front of the colt. She kept some of the accent, but dropped the arrogance. The cutie mark crusaders would have laughed at her bad imitation of Sweetie Belle's sister. She responded to the question by once again looking pointedly up at the moon, full and majestic. "Yes." Little Knot Macintosh looked at her with a striking amount of concern. Leave it to a little colt barely old enough to go to school to worry about Nightmare Moon.
Alright, back to the story. So Nyx has just booped the colts. There was much booping and adorableness, and so on. So, okay, Cousin Colt Multer, "Oh no, I am no legend," blah 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 blah. She pooped it. Okay, here we go. She couldn't help it. She even made the boop noises upon contact and giggled alongside the colts. Once they settled down, little Knot Macintosh spoke up. "Were you on the moon for 1,000 years? Nyx sat down on her haunches on the cold floor in front of the colt. She kept some of the accent, but dropped the arrogance. The Kitty Mark Crusaders would have laughed at her bad imitation of Sweetie Belle's sister. She responded to the question by once again looking pointedly up at the moon, full and majestic. "Yes." Little Knot Macintosh looked at her with a striking amount of concern. Leave it to a little colt barely old enough to go to school to worry about Nightmare Moon. "Were you lonely?" "Oh yes, very. Or at least so I'm told." This caused a detectable change in the colts in front of her. Cousin Colt spoke up. "You don't remember?" "No," Nyx replied. "When I came back to planet Equus, I had a complete case of amnesia. I didn't remember a thing." "What's the first thing you remember?" Cousin Colt asked. "Technically crashing the summer sun celebration. But that was a silent film, photographed through Luna's eyes. She did not have any memories of what that felt like. The first thing I remember is cold, then pain. Then I woke up and I was surrounded by thorns. I was inside a thorn bush in the middle of a forest. I did not know my own name. I didn't know anything." "You didn't remember anything?" "No, I didn't. I didn't even know who Nightmare Moon was." "You would not believe how I found out." And she laughed, a short burst of bell-like laughter. I'm not even going to try that. It was Luna's laugh when she felt comfortable. Nyx must have started picking it up. "How?" Cousin Colt asked. "A school play." "What?" "It was a school play about Nightmare Moon." "You went to a school play about Nightmare Moon?" Cousin Colt puzzled.
The adults didn't see you? Oh, of course they saw me. I was up on the stage. But they weren't alarmed. See, after all, I was supposed to be acting in the play. I was an important actress. She placed her hoof on her chest and closed her eyes and shimmied her body at this. You can't have the play without the villain. And I was playing the villain, Equestria's true queen, ruler of the night eternal, Nightmare Moon. This pronouncement was met with confused looks from the both of them. Then Cousin Colt again. Are you really Nightmare Moon? I am most definitely Nightmare Moon. You just said you were an actress. Time to get big again and put on the show. Lay it extra thick, Nyx thought. She stood up quickly and spread her wings. With her voice more arrogant than ever, she stated, I see a couple of naysayers in front of me. Nyx slightly laughed at her own pun. She looked down at the Colts. I am not some actress. I am not some imitator. I am not some street performer. And I will prove it. Oh, yes. Nyx had not learned much Pegasi magic, but she knew enough to cast a small spell that caused a current of wind with a radius of 10 pointlings to circle upon itself. She cast it and increased the wind speed just enough so that her mane and feathers ruffled, and more importantly, that the Colts felt the cold wind rushing around them. It seemed to have the desired effect as their eyes grew wide. How old are you foals? 7? 9, Cousin Colt answered somewhat defiantly. And I'm 8, Little Knot Macintosh said, but after a look from Cousin Colt, he amended himself. Almost 8. I see. Well, then you won't remember, but your cousin may. Ask your parents about why the sun went away for 2 weeks 5 summers ago. You did that, Cousin Colt stated. It was clear from the slight glimmer of fear and awe in his eyes that he remembered. Yes, I did. I took over this city. I took over that castle right there. She gestured to the other side of the overlook, from where the castle grounds would be visible just below. Do you want to know how I did it? They both nodded. Nyx cast her magic on both of them, dragging them forward just a couple of feet as a show of force. She then leaned down and unfurled her wings, resting one of her wingtips on Cousin Colt's right shoulder and the other on Little Knot Macintosh's left shoulder. In one sense, it was a protective move, like a mother hen protecting her chicks, meant to signify she was letting them in on a secret. In another sense, it was a power move, reminding her they were under her control. Cousin Colt seemed legitimately scared. There was a controlled fear, and he leaned in attentively towards her. Little Knot Macintosh, too young to remember the sun vanishing, had a huge smile on his face. She lowered her head on its long neck so it was at the same height as the two Colts. Then she drew them in closer with her wings and placed her head between the Colts, so that Cousin Colt was perhaps an inch off her left cheek, and Little Knot Macintosh an inch off her right. It made it all very conspiratorial, but also meant that her eyes, her fangs, her hot breath would be immediately upon them. Cousin Colt shuddered a bit, and Nyx surprised herself as she realized that she was genuinely enjoying his fear. Nyx turned to him and was about to whisper if he was okay, when Cousin Colt eagerly spoke first. Tell me how you did it. Ah, so he was enjoying his own fear as well. Perfect. Nyx spoke in a low, gravely whispered. They had armies looking for me everywhere. In the morning, Celestia would fly out at the head of her army, and then she would return in the evening and rest, while Luna would go out looking for me instead. Some ponies close to Celestia had vanished, most especially 2 of her own former students, and they knew that they had something to do with me. They knew I was back and ready to strike. They were desperate to find me. So desperate, in fact, that guards assigned to Candlelit Castle, the very same kind of guards you see here tonight, were being sent out to find me. This meant that the castle was short of guards, and every time Celestia and Luna changed shifts, the reserve companies would change shift as well. So every shift change, 100 reserve guards, really just civilians that had volunteered and received barely a week of training, would come in to support the guard troops. They would be paired, one-on-one with experienced guards, and do the security rounds within the castle. Meanwhile, the
more battle-hardened troops manned the entrance to Camelot, set up a perimeter fence around the whole city, and went out with the regular army to look for me. My uncle had also set up around the barrier, around the castle, that would be an impenetrable barrier to any alicorn that tried to get in. The thing is, they thought I would show up with an army of monsters or something. But that night, as Luna's enough to hunt for me, and Celestia ordered some carrot soup to calm herself down so she could go to sleep. They didn't know that I was already in the castle. How? The reservists. See, my uncle had his barrier calibrated to stop any pony as powerful as an alicorn from getting in. So what I did was I split myself into 100 different ponies, a full company. So I came in as a company during one of the shift changes. I was the company, and so 1% at a time I walked straight through the barrier undetected, and once all of me was inside, I sprung the trap. I cast a sleeping spell on the guard I was paired with, then I went to find my uncle and took him out, turning off the magic defenses he set up. I found Celestia in the throne room and dueled her and locked her away in the sun. The same with Luna when she came in the morning. I was the queen of Equestria, undisputed sovereign monarch of the land. My word was the law. My will was the will of the nation. My eternal night was majestic. But do you want to know a secret? Two cold heads eagerly nodding. Eternal night sucks! And at this proclamation, the cults burst into laughter. Nyx removed her wings from them, stood up and started talking in her normal day-to-day Nyx voice, clear and crystalline, losing her affectation. No, seriously, it's cold, and you can't play outside. The farmers can't grow their crops, and no. Also, being queen sucks. Like, sitting on the throne sucks so very much. It really does. I have no idea how Celestia handled 1,000 years without her sister. It's so lonely. I mean, you might as well be a prisoner. Truly. Then Cousin Colt again. Did your uncle die? What? No! What makes you think that? You said you took him out. Oh, no, I just put him to sleep. Oh, okay, we got into a bit of a hoof fight at first, but all I ended up doing was I put him to sleep. Look, my uncle is fine. I love him. He has the cutest little filly. We get along great. I babysit his daughter when he's in town. Look, I am not proud of what I did, but I am proud of how I did it. I did not spill a single drop of blood. That is why I did it that way. They were expecting an army and a great battle. But if I did that, ponies would die. I did not want anyone to die. Those guards all had lives and loved ones. Chances are one of the guards on this overlook tonight is one of the guards I put to sleep that night. I am a dangerous mare, but I am no danger to you, or this town, or Equestria. Oh, we know that, Cousin Colt squealed. We saw you talking to that guard earlier. He didn't arrest you. He seemed to really like you. Dear Mount Cantelot, if you could kindly open up a fissure and swallow me up at this moment, it would be greatly appreciated. Signed, Nyx the Mortified. Yeah, she said, trying to get her dry mouth to function. Just know that the reason I am a free mare is because I made a promise to Luna that I would protect you, all of you, and I meant it. I'm on your side. And if you ever see me and you need help, I'll help you. I promise. Little Knot Macintosh raised his hoof and waited to be recognized. When he saw Nyx looking at him, he softly asked, Miss Moon? Squee! Was he really raising his hoof to ask a question like the most polite little school cold ever? Did he really just call me Miss Moon? Was he, at this moment, the most adorable thing on planet Echoes? Oh, be still, my heart, I can die happy now. Put a fork on me, 'cause I am done. Oh, you sweet little thing. What can I do for you? How is it that you have an uncle? I mean, if you were on the moon for 1,000 years, how was your uncle still alive when you came back? Oh, better disengage. Nyx was happy with the fact that they only knew her as Nightmare Moon. Indeed, she had made a point of not asking their names for that reason. Explaining how her family's dynamics worked would be hard to do without a lot of very identifying information she would rather not disclose. Where are your parents? Cousin Colt spoke. My parents and his parents are back at the bed and breakfast. They let us come up to the overlook since they saw all the guards everywhere. They just told to stick to my big sister. And, where is your big sister? Oh, she started talking to that guard you were talking to, and then wouldn't stop talking. It was so boring. And then I remembered you, and I convinced little Cuzzier to come talk to you. Nyx looked towards where Sergeant Sweeper had gone, and sure enough, standing in front of him was a very tall and rather pretty earth pony mare, perhaps 3 or so years older than Nyx herself. She was intensely engaged in conversation, and from the way she was standing, it was clear that the conversation was flirtatious. Shadow, too, looked oddly relaxed. Perhaps his shift was near its end. There was a motion from one of Sergeant Sweeper's wings. Nyx could detect, with her keen eyesight, that there was a small piece of parchment or paper in his wing. The mare opened her saddlebag, and Sergeant Sweeper dropped the item inside. Why, Shadow, that wouldn't happen to be your address in the times you're off tomorrow, would it? Looks like I left you pent up and in need of stress relief. Well, good on you. I knew you were a magnet for the out-of-town mares the moment I saw you. They should put your good looks to use by putting you on a recruiting poster. Maybe Rumble would sign up then. Listen, I think the two of you should head back to Big Sis before she comes looking for you and finds you talking to the boogie mare. Off you go. Tut-tut-tut. And Nyx made shooing motions with her wings. They trotted off at a half-gallop, talking excitedly. Then Little Knot Macintosh stopped, turned around, waved a hoof in the air and shouted out, "Bye, Miss Moon!" before galloping back after Cousin Colt in the direction of where Big Sis and Sergeant Sweeper were certainly finalizing the details of tomorrow's date. Yes, she would join the guard one day. Yes, she would wear the officer candidate's cadet uniform one day. And then one day, an officer's full uniform. One day. But one of the greatest benefits of being an alicorn was that time was on her side. And she could do other things first. And she knew that once she was done with Celestia school, and long before she was off to the military, to the Royal Military Academy, she would take time to take care of more pressing needs. And right now, she felt that there was nothing she yearned for more than a little Knot Macintosh of her own. Heck, a Cousin Colt wouldn't hurt either. She felt warm and whole. And as she began to walk towards the other end of the overlook, and then down the start of the ramp that zigzagged down the mountaintop and past the castle, visions of a gray-maned Pegasus playing with a little foal danced through her head. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. A clean, well-lighted place. Will be read tomorrow.